You're listening to Voice Acting Mastery, episode number 172.
Welcome to the Voice Acting Mastery podcast with Crispin Freeman. VoiceActingMastery.com is your place to learn both the skills and the mindset you need to become a professional voice actor, even if you're just getting started. In each episode of this podcast, you'll discover valuable tips, tricks, and insider information to help you portray characters in animation, video games, and beyond. And now here's your host, voice actor Crispin Freeman.
Hi there. My name is Crispin Freeman, and I'll be your guide through the world of voice acting. If you'd like to know more about me, feel free to check out my personal website at www.crispinfreeman.com. Welcome to the first part of my interview with voice actress and voice director Lisa Ortiz. It's a real honor to have Lisa on the podcast, since she played the lead character, Lena Inverse, in the first anime series I ever worked on as a voice actor, The Slayers. You may also know Lisa as the voice of Deedlit in the anime series Record of Lodoss War, Amy Rose in the Sonic X animated series, and numerous characters in both the Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime franchises. Lisa has also voice-directed many animated series and games, including over 150 episodes of Pokemon. Lisa and I both got our start as voice actors in the late 1990s in New York City. But it wasn't long before our paths ended up diverging. In November of 2001, I moved to Los Angeles, while Lisa stayed in New York in order to pursue voiceover opportunities there. For the next 18 years, we both worked as voice actors on opposite coasts of the country, until late 2019, when Lisa decided to make the move to Los Angeles herself. I've been eager to chat with her about what the voiceover industry has been like in New York while I was gone, and what insights she can share for those of my listeners who may live closer to the Big Apple than Southern California. We begin our discussion by reminiscing about our time working on The Slayers. Back then, the anime dubbing industry in New York City was just getting started, and the two of us got in on the ground floor, so to speak. While we both had theatrical acting training, learning how to perform in a small recording booth without a scene partner and matching the lip flap of a character on a video screen was a new challenge for us. We were often figuring out our dubbing technique on the fly and learning from each other as we went. Both of us relied on our theater training to help us find a physicality for our characters, which helped our performances sound more authentic and believable. It also helped us avoid stiff or awkward line readings. Strangely enough, pursuing a career as a voice actor might never have happened for Lisa if she hadn't woken up one morning and found that her car had gone missing. Her efforts to track down her car and the serendipitous adventures that followed eventually led to her being able to audition for her first anime dubbing job. In fact, the more you learn about Lisa's journey as a voice actor, the more you'll hear how much serendipity has played an important role in the development of her career. Her success hasn't all been due to mere luck, however. As the saying goes, luck is when preparation meets opportunity, and Lisa has always been very committed to being as prepared as possible. Even with all her experience, she's still eager to learn more and develop her acting skills even further. I really admire her commitment to the craft of acting. It's a pleasure to have her on the podcast, and I'm so happy that I get to share her story with you.
And now, the feature segment.
Lisa, welcome to the podcast. It is an honor and a pleasure to have you here.
It's an honor and a pleasure to be here, Mr. Freeman.
Yay! So, I'm so excited to have you on the podcast. It's wonderful chatting with you. It is a trip down memory lane for me because you and I worked on the first animated show that I ever worked on, which was The Slayers, way back in the late 90s.
Yeah. It's a trip down memory lane for me, too.
It's total trip.
It's kind of fun, yeah.
Yeah. No, in fact, my wife and I decided we would go back and watch some of the Slayers episodes just to remind ourselves of, like, what was it like back then when I was first getting into voice acting and we were working on that show together. It was crazy listening to this sort of younger version of myself in all of those shows.
Yeah, I sat down with my boyfriend and showed him some of the stuff. He was like, "What is this?" I'm like, "Just watch it." And he's like, "Oh, wow." And I'm like, and I was listening to myself and I'm like, "Wow, okay." I'm like, you know, I'm like, it was younger. But not too tragically different. I'm like, I've deepened out. I'm wiser now.
Well, yeah, and it's so funny because we did that original those 3 seasons of Slayers. Slayers, Next, and Try. And then they came back 10 years later to do Revolution and Evolution R Slayers, like seasons 4 and 5, I guess. And we had to sort of just jump right back into where we were.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always curious how that was for you because for me, it's a very weird thing. I try to explain time to people. It was with that show particularly and with Lena because of the way that having done it so much and the way that I had kind of like worked on it and prepped on it. I used to just I had a pose that I would go into because I always sort of ground things in my body.
Yeah.
So all I had to do was like put my hands behind my head and that kind of thing. And I was like, oh, there she is. I'm like, that's her voice.
Yeah, no,
weird thing.
It was weird because when I was going back and thinking, okay, I'm going to play Zell, and I listened to myself, I was like, wow, because that was my first time playing a main. I mean, the first character I ever did in anime was in the Slayers, but it was just a one-off. It was the Prince Hallis character who tries to marry Lena, and then I auditioned for Zelgadis and booked him. And because it was so early in my career, I was still trying to figure out the whole coordination with the lip flap and everything. And sometimes I would talk very slowly to try to match the lip flap, and we probably should have just rewritten the line with more words so that it would sound more natural. And so I was still sort of figuring out my coordination with all this, whereas I felt like you, and I came in late because you all had done the first 13 episodes of the first season, and then there was this sort of pause and interregnum of some time, and then they came back to do episodes 13 through 26, and that's when I joined. So you'd had 13 episodes of Slayers plus the other shows you'd worked on like Record of Lotus War and whatnot, and I was brand new and I was just trying to catch up with all of you. And but it was weird going back then and listening to that and thinking, okay, I want to sound like I did back then, but it's 10 years later now with Slayers, Revolution, and Evolution R. And how do I make sure that I sound like myself from 10 years ago? And I found it was less about like my voice. Like it wasn't that hard to put my voice back in the same place. It was harder to think like I was back then. You know, like, okay, I got to think simpler. Like I got to think the way that I thought when I was playing Zell back then, because if I try to do it now, it's going to, and I don't want to sound older. Right? And not in my voice, but in my spirit. Like, I don't want to sound psychologically older. I want to sound the way Zell sounded back then.
You know, it's funny because, yeah, I can see that a lot of going into it when I did it. When I talk about like grounding it, like putting it in the body and that, it was also like a spirit. It was for sort of like a spirit way of approaching it too, I think. And I do think that there's a lot of ways if you're thinking technically, I've always been kind of like a technical person first, but then I throw everything away. So it gets very like in the body and just sort of like reactive to kind of things. So it was like, that's what set it on there. And it was, I don't know, she came back a little more complicated, but I think like for me, her spirit was, I had always set her in this sort of like vaudevillian, like Mae West world. So like tapping into that energy kept me there. But yeah, it was definitely a trip, but I feel like it kind of, the time kind of disappeared after a little while in the booth. At the beginning it was, but then after a while it was kind of just continuous. It's so interesting because back, I feel like when we started, and like for me, Lotus was the first time that anything ever happened. Lotus was my first job that I had ever done, Lotus War Deedlit. And I had no experience with dubbing, no idea what it would be. Like my experience coming into that was literally I used to watch cartoons in the morning and then I would just sort of like turn the volume off and just like kind of like match and go along or make new words to them. So I used to improv to what was on screen. So I think in a weird way, not not having that and just coming at it sort of just the same way that I would come at something from the stage, or I had to kind of figure out how to translate how I had been working to this thing where suddenly you had no people that you were talking to. By the time we came back the second time, I knew where you were. I knew what you were going to, I kind of had senses of how people were going to react, and I already knew these people. So that was kind of fun.
Oh, so you had gotten a sense of who we were as actors. And so when you would get in the booth, you could sort of imagine how we might deliver the lines?
Yeah, which sort of helps when you're reacting to what the person said before you. So even if you weren't in there, when I remember when I first started on it, going in, and it was Slayers particularly was a strange thing for me because I was so used to just being on stage. So I had somebody I was working off of. So when I first started, like you said, going into that, I was trying to figure out how do I work against somebody when there's nobody there, So that for me, sometimes they would play the Japanese, sometimes they would do that. And I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what the undercurrents of the person was saying to me so that I could react to that. I don't know I feel so Meisner. But yeah, so when we came back, it was a lot easier to have a little sense of what was going on. I don't know. I liked that sort of reunion feel. Do you feel like you got there? Did you feel like you had to drop away a lot of stuff to get back into that mindset?
I think it's more that I remember, my favorite Looney Tunes cartoons were all the Chuck Jones stuff in the 50s. Mm-hmm. And I remember all the amazing voice acting that Mel Blanc did in those cartoons. And then I remember hearing Mel Blanc play those same characters later in life. Mm-hmm. And there was something off about them. They were like weightier in some way. It was like he was trying to get more nuance in them or something. And I remember seeing a video of Frank Welker talking about Megatron and how he had played Megatron in the original Transformers animated series. And then they brought him back to do Megatron later, and he tried to add all this subtlety to it. And in the interview, he's like, I'm trying to do Megatron, and he's a little darker, and he's a little more subtle now. He's not so over the top. He's not like he was in the old version. And then he goes back and does the old, I'm Megatron. Like, he does the old Megatron, and you're like, oh, can I have the old Megatron, please? I don't want the new Megatron. I don't want the new Coke. I want the old Megatron, right? And so part of me was like, I don't want to overcomplicate what I was doing as Zell. It's like the Beatles coming back and like redoing one of their songs, but with all new instruments and new plugins. And it's like, I don't know if that's not going to be any better, guys. Like there's a rawness to the way it was back then. We were flying by the seat of our pants on that show. Yeah. And that was part of the joy of it, was that it was sort of loosey-goosey and we were making fun and having fun with each other. And so I wanted to recapture that spontaneity and not get too pondering with what I was doing as Zell. So a lot of it was just putting myself back in that sort of younger mindset.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I like that. There's a part in that with that particular character, and I do see that. And there's a lot of moments where there was a chance, especially for me to get a little to throw a little of that stuff in. But there's something there was always. And I do hear that with other stuff and with other characters, and I definitely have a more complicated approach at times to things that I do now. But there's something that I feel like, and for me, it was that setting, that coming back. There's the play that you're talking about. There's like that freedom, and then there's this part of you that you have to turn off at some point. And that is hard for me sometimes as I've gotten older. I work with a woman, a voice teacher who's a mentor to me, and we would do a lot of vocal stuff, and she would refuse to explain to me why we would do certain things because she knew that I was going to sit there and overcomplicate the process and try and figure it out. So I do think that that's there. I think, I was I don't know. Now you've got me thinking. I'm like, do I sound older when she returned? Is she a more mature Lena as she's gone through the world? But, started on a pirate ship, so
yeah, I mean,
maybe that changed me.
Zelgadis was not a sophisticated character in the beginning, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, he acted sophisticated, but he had a pretty simple thing. So, I mean, it's wonderful to reminisce about this, but the reason why I'm having fun talking about this and going down memory lane with you is because this is how I started as a voice actor, and I'm curious, and I want to share with my audience, how did you get started as a voice actor? And from what I've heard, it has something to do with your car being stolen.
Yes. I started, my career started in a chain of very serendipitous events in various different ways. But I was in school studying theater, training classically, and to go, to do stage work, to do Broadway, to do different onstage things.
Where were you in school?
What? I went to school at Hofstra.
Hofstra. Okay,
Yeah,
that's
Hofstra University.
in New York.
In New York, yeah.
Okay.
We did a lot of Shakespeare, a lot of like Renaissance and like Jacobean theater, and a lot of physical stuff.
Wow.
A lot of various different stuff. So it was a very traditional sort of training.
Was this undergraduate?
This was undergraduate. I was in a BFA program over there. So that was my first start into actual classical, like into training.
Gotcha.
I was a Shakespeare enthusiast.
Of course.
Like that was sort of my thing. But yeah, so I was doing that, and in a bizarre fit of things, I got mono, so I had to drop out.
Oh no.
And which is fine. But then one part of that recovery, I didn't know what I was going to do. And I had a car at the time that I called Faith, Faye. And it also had mono because the battery would die every single day. So I left it parked outside, and I would put the keys up. And my brother took the keys to the car, drove it over to a friend's house, and he would steal my car in the morning. And that's why I always say, like, he did that, and then my other brother became a cop. But he would steal the car, drove off. I woke up, no car. I get a phone call randomly. It's him. And he's like, hey, just so you know, your car's dead, and it's at George's house. And I'm like, who the hell is George? And he just hangs up because that was my brother.
So your brother would just treat your car like an Uber? Like just decided it was his personal chariot?
There were no Ubers. He was an older brother, and I had a car, and he did not. So therefore, it was sibling. It was sibling rivalry stuff. The beginning, the genesis of most things. So so he took my car. He left it somewhere. The next person to call was a mutual friend of ours who was a good friend of mine to this day, my friend Rob. And he's like, hey, is Jeremy there? I'm like, no, but do you know who George is? Because he has my car. And we went on this trip, on this crazy sort of adventure to go there. We wound up looking for a car battery, found George's thing. There was a strange outdoor circus that's something like Something Wicked This Way Comes. It was a very strange adventure. But what wound up happening is at the end of it, he asked me, he's like, hey, I'm working at this place called Central Park Media. And do you know any actors or anybody who you might want to recommend? Or we're trying to find people to come in, because at this point they didn't have themselves down. They had just started. I think when you came in also was this large pull to sort of find talent around to put into this, what was essentially a new sort of market, or just starting off in at least in New York anyway.
Yeah, and for people who don't know, Central Park Media was a licensing company that was buying the licenses for different anime series and distributing them in America. And so one of the things they needed to do was they would release it not only subtitled, but they'd also have to dub it as well.
Yeah, and that was, and I think up until this point, I think in some other markets they had taken, in the beginning, they just took people who they saw and sort of put them in. So now this was like their first big push to get real, legitimate talent and actors and people who were doing things to come in and really make it into I guess like an art form of what they were doing. And so, so I was there, and I was like, well, you could ask me, because, I'm here. I'm here in your car. And I was studying theater, and it was really one of those moments where it was preparation meets opportunity. They called me in. The first audition that I went on was Lotus War. And apparently I wound up I wound up booking more than one of those. I went in and it was sort of my dream come true. And I hate saying this, but it was my sort of Disney princess voice. I didn't get to play ingenues on stage, so this for me was a huge deal. I was
Right,
like
sure.
to get to go in, because I guess physically they didn't see me that way. So getting to have my voice do that was something different. But yeah, so that's I went in for that first audition, and from there, there was a lot of sort of people coming into sessions and being like, "Oh, bring her to this other thing. Come over here and do this," which was really cool and very interesting, but a very false way of how everything sort of works.
So your friend Rob was working at Central
Mm-hmm.
Park Media, and he called
Yes.
you into audition for Record of Lotus War, and you auditioned for Deedlit, the main elf female lead,
I
Where-
auditioned for Deedlit and The Witch.
and the witch, which is Carla, right?
Yes.
Oh, okay. She's like
Yes.
the main antagonist. So, wow, I am pulling this data back from like 20 years
Yeah,
ago.
I know. I'm impressed. I am
you.
impressed. I actually, that's the one that I rewatched recently.
Oh, yeah. So where did you audition for? Did they have a studio at the Central Park Media offices?
No. We auditioned. I don't even remember the name of the company, but it was the same building that all the MTV stuff was auditioning for at the time. So I went into New York. I was living on Long Island at the time. So I took a train in. I went into Manhattan. We went into this big, it was a huge studio. It was the first time I had ever been in something like that. I think it was almost like a soundstage at the time. Some of the later stuff would move over to buttons and things, but it was this huge, massive, building complex that I went in, and so it was a really, really nice recording studio. But yeah, there was a whole bunch of other projects. I think there was news going on down at the bottom floor. So it was for me at the time, it was a very exciting but intimidating sort of prospect. Now I look back at that and I'm like, I was so fresh off the boat.
So before then, the Central Park Media company had just been pulling random friends in to do the voices on things?
I feel like that's sort of where, and I don't want to speak out of turn, but I feel like the way that this started, because a lot of that stuff that came in started with a sort of fan base. They initially were grabbing people to fill in roles, do things, or they were pulling from the people that they had, because I didn't know if they hadn't really created it into a market. But then they really did a hard push to get the New York talent and to get legitimate and get actors in there. So they weren't working with just people in the office or fans or things like that. They wanted there was a lot of really really heavy hitting interesting talent that came in on a lot of those early projects.
So what year was that when you auditioned for Lotus War?
You gotta make me say this out loud.
I'm not saying how old you were. I'm just saying what year it was.
That was, I think it was about 95, 96.
Oh, okay. So 95, 96. Because I didn't audition for Slayers or anything, I think until 97 is the earliest I might have done it.
I auditioned for Lotus War, and I thought to myself, and I didn't hear anything, and I thought, well, I certainly didn't get it. I auditioned for it. 6 months later, they called me in. And it's funny, you were talking about Carla. They had said, we actually liked you for both these, but we had no idea who you are. So they were like, try her for this. But 6 months, 6 months I waited for that, yeah. And it was sort of like a slow process. And from there, I started to work a lot.
Gotcha. And because what happened was that Central Park Media had more shows and you had become a known quantity. And so did they have you audition for the new shows they were getting, or did they just start casting you?
No. I auditioned for everything, but it was one of those things where I guess in the beginning, as they were sort of building up and doing that, they would have a lot of times you would have producers or you would have other guys come in on the session. I've worked, I think in some of those sessions, you would have 3 or 4 guys from the company come in and just listen in and just, I guess they were also learning the ropes. That first project was with a man, rest his soul, Michael Albin, who had done a lot of things. He was really wonderful.
Yes.
And I'd worked on that also with Bill Timoney at the time.
Oh,
and
yeah,
this
yeah.
was, and I was still fresh, but they were sort of showing other people the ropes. So you'd get people come in and then they'd just be like, hey, have her come in for this other thing. We're auditioning. And so that was how I got a lot of my sessions, was they sat in on my session and called me into something else.
Gotcha. Because Bill Timoney was playing Parn in Lotus War, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, Michael Albin was such a sweetheart. I met him later in my career too, and we actually he had at that time he had linked up with Joe DeGiorgi.
Yes, Joe.
At the what was it, Headline Studios? Was that his
Headline?
Yeah, Headline
Still
Studios in Irvington, right? Oh God, I loved going there. It was so much fun to get on the train and go to Irvington to record up there. So he and Joe had linked up, and then Michael wanted me to come in and be like sort of the anime expert, and be his dramaturg in ways. And we were just about to start on this big show when he had his heart attack and passed away, which was so sad. It came out of the blue.
Yeah, that day, it was very sad and came out of the blue. We were very family out there. Like I recently worked with Joe on an anime, Emma, that came out over here last year. And, but I mentioned that because he's such a good man and it was such a great environment. And, I remember him saying later on, like a couple of years later, he's like, it's so funny to see you now. He's like, because when you came into that room, he's like, I wouldn't, Crispin, I was so scared. I wouldn't even go and ask to go to the bathroom. Like they asked me, I was so like, I felt so lucky to be in that room. Like it felt like such a freak accident. I remember working through like a 4-hour session. They were like, do you want to take a break? And they like ordered lunch for everybody. Do you want like order lunch? And I was like, oh no, I'm good. I could still keep going. I'm like, I rehearsed for 4 hours. I could totally do this for 4 hours. That's great. Now I, of course, would feel very differently about that. I feel like I need a break.
No, it's true. It's funny. It's funny you say that because I remember like I had a full day at Irvington. I mean, the thing was I was living in Manhattan as well, so I would have to take the train, the Metro North train up the Hudson and get off at Irvington to go record at Headlines, which was always like going on a vacation. It was always
it was gorgeous, beautiful.
Oh, so right by the Tappan Zee Bridge, and so you go up there. It was so gorgeous up there. But I remember I had one day where I had like a full day of recording, like 4 hours on Record of Lotus War Chronicles of the Heroic Knight, which is the TV series that came after the original OVA. And I remember we did like 4 hours of recording, and I was exhausted. And we had lunch, and like I slept on Joe's couch for like half an hour, and then we had to record for another 4 hours in the afternoon. I'm like, okay, I can do this. But yeah, I mean, when you're you think, oh my God, this is I have to be ready. I have to make sure that I can do this. But you also have to be smart about, well, there are human limits, right? You should be able to go to the bathroom and get sustenance. And because otherwise you push yourself too hard, not only can you hurt yourself, but also your performance will suffer. You're not going to be in a good headspace or body space to be able to give the best performance.
Yeah, and I think that was, I mean, they were always super good and very cool. I think it was also just, knowing that now, and there's like, I of course like make sure you take breaks, make sure you do things, vocal rest, all the stuff that you sort of need to get yourself through sessions. And I worry sometimes like that with people now, especially on things that are very shouty. But at the time, I think it was more out of just like an excitement and a not, and a just not knowing. Just like I said, feeling very lucky and feeling very, very happy to just sort of be doing this thing that I had dreamed about, that I thought was a really cool thing. Just excitement.
So where did it go from there? Because you didn't just stop by working at Central Park Media, because then Pokemon happened, right?
Yeah. It was such a strange time, because I know there's a lot of stuff. I recently had, we'll get to 4 Kids in a second, but Pokemon came. I wasn't on the initial auditions for that. I actually came in the beginning of the first season. So I think about like the fifth season in, they were like, oh, then they heard, they're like, ask this girl. I was this girl. Ask this girl to come in. She's doing a lot of stuff on the other things. And this is one of the reasons why I say it was a blessing. It was very serendipitous, and that in a way was a blessing, because I wound up falling into a lot of things, and I was prepared to take those opportunities. But I wasn't consciously building this thing. I was going in and opportunities were sort of coming, and there was like this burgeoning studio. Then 4 Kids came up and they started building rooms and they were looking for people. So you wound up, as long as you were in that current, you wound up going to a lot of auditions. And so you wound up going to a lot of auditions, booking things, having a bunch of projects that we're working on. And suddenly there was like this explosion of what I feel like became the beginning of what for anime where it would sort of jump into the mainstream. Like suddenly it was, you were in this studio that had all these different projects that were going on at the same time. So it was very, very, it was very fun. But yeah, I think I did Slayers. We did that. Pokemon showed up. I had no idea that was going to be what it was. Nobody did. I had no idea I'd still be doing it many years later. And then 4Kids came. And that was, I don't even remember exactly what my first project with them, because technically Pokemon at the time was there. But then I started working on things like the times all kind of like roll into each other. But Sonic and Winx Club started over there. And then they had a bunch of projects. So you wound up going in and working on various different things, going from room to room. And it was just a very fun sort of, especially for an actor starting out, it was a really, really fun sort of environment.
Okay, yeah. So and just so people understand how this all works, because it may just sound like magic. Like suddenly you got cast in Lotus War, and then it all the Yellow Brick Road opened up for you, and it all became what's happening is that Central Park Media is the licensing company, and they would hire recording studios to produce the dubs. And the one that I worked at most often was Sonomat with Dan Rich.
Yes,
but I know there were other ones too. And then what would happen is those studios would get hired by other licensing companies too. So Sonomat, where we did Slayers, is also where we did Utena for Central Park Media. But it was also where The Right Stuff, which had licensed The Irresponsible Captain Tyler, they also recorded at Sonomat. So once you had become an actor at one of these recording studios, you became a known quantity. And then when other licensing companies would come and want to do stuff, they would say, oh, we've got this Rolodex of actors while we have them come and audition. And I remember at the time, Taj Productions was like this middleman. So like Central Park Media would hire this company called Taj Productions, and then Taj Productions would hire Sonomat to do the recording. And then Taj started building their own studios. I remember that's when they first started doing Pokemon, right? They built a studio in their offices. And I remember recording in there once. So this is all sort of, but this, I thought when Pokemon started, it was 4Kids. Was it not 4Kids?
When Pokemon started, it was 4Kids, and what wound up happening is that they quickly reached their studio capacity. And so they started to go to these other studios, and a lot of it was the music industry. People who had, some of the music industry areas had collapsed. So you had all these guys who had these really great recording studios that were going on. And so they were able to pick up this, slack. We went to them. I went to Button Sound, I think was one of the first places that we went to. Matlin. There were a whole bunch of different studios around the city. And so this was sort of what was going on. So yeah, you became a known quantity at one. You were still auditioning. You auditioned for everything. Occasionally you might be thrown in for some other roles or brought in for side things, but you auditioned for everything. And I make a point. I know it sounds weird because I make it sound a little like magic, because that influenced how the rest of my career went. Because this was such a weird burgeoning of things that sort of were coming in, I wasn't, the intelligent design that you need to have as an actor when you go into that was something that I had to build and learn. And it's funny, you made a comment, I don't know if it's still in here, before you're talking about we're talking about Slayers and coming back to it, and you wanted to drop some of the things that you had brought on over time. And it's funny, I feel like instinctually there's a lot of stuff that I had to create technique to recapture what I started initially doing, because I don't know if that makes sense. Like, it's sort of like it was a very instinctual process, so it took me a while to sort of master and understand to recreate it consistently in that same way.
Yeah,
does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it does. And just for clarification, we keep saying 4Kids. We don't mean FORKIDS, as in something that is for kids, but rather the company, which is called the number 4 Kids.
Yes.
So
4 Kids.
There's a production company called 4Kids, which is spelled with the number 4 and then KIDS. Yeah. And they were
4
the ones
Kids. Their Saturday morning, they had their Fox box. So yeah.
Gotcha. So you were figuring out this sort of technique on the fly. Talk to me about that. What did that mean that you were sort of, is that what you were doing when you were working on anime in the beginning? You were trying to figure out your acting technique?
I told you I had been trained. I was trained for theater for stage. And for me, like you said, you came in, you were focused on the timing of things and how you would stretch reads and do that. I was trying to figure out the way I had to negotiate it. I managed, because I had like a musical background and all that, there was a timing issue. I was pretty fair. I could grab the timing of things. But to me, the way that I had approached things, it was weird to not act off of a person. I needed to I was very reactive. I was very about connecting the things. So I had to teach. I was hooking into different things. I was hooking into the physicality of the performer on the screen. I was trying to figure out how do you create a performance that you're working off of in your mind of the person when they're not there and you're not sure who they are. Like, it was great when I don't know if that makes sense to you, but I was trying to, in my mind while I was doing it, recreate the stage, because that was my background.
Absolutely.
I wasn't thinking of it at the time technically like how I would now about, approaching the microphone and doing all this. I was just trying to world build while I was doing it and figure out how to recreate the stage in my head while I was in there, which is kind of, but you don't realize what you're doing until you're doing it, if that makes sense.
Sure. And this is something I try to express to my students all the time, which is acting is not a mental exercise. And voice acting isn't even just a vocal exercise. Acting is a physical exercise.
Very physical, yeah.
If your heart rate doesn't go up, if your adrenaline isn't pumping, if you don't get that sort of galvanic sweat response, whatever is appropriate for the scene, if you're not physically going through the ringer, we're not going to believe what's happening to you. We're not going to believe that you're actually experiencing what's happening. So it makes total sense to me that here you are basically thrown in a sensory deprivation tank, right? You're in this room, this glass fishbowl, with a microphone in front of you and a screen with flashing images. And somehow you have to make this feel as physical and visceral as if you've gone through an hour and a half of a Shakespeare play on stage and you're sweating under the lights. And I share that theater background with you, and this notion that acting is supposed to be physical and you're supposed to be connecting and interacting with your fellow actors on stage, and having all that taken away from you and having to recreate. That's why I often say it's like you have to create this virtual reality of the world in your head with such veracity that your body responds to it sort of viscerally. That's what has to happen in order to get the best performances.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was very visceral. And I do have to say, I would always try and get into that space. And then
Me?
Yes.
What?
You would leave outtakes. People would
saying?
leave outtakes, and they used to sort of like disrupt that when I go in. So I just want to thank you
Outtakes?
years later. It would always bring me, I'm like, here, and I'm like, oh, damn it. What am I going to do? But it was also fun. It's like you're not thinking about that. But that's sort of, sort of it depends on how, it's sort of an approach thing. But it was such a weird time because there wasn't a lot of people that I could talk to that were doing this kind of work, that were doing dubbing work in the city at the time. So you were kind of just sort of figuring it out.
Yeah, no, we were all figuring it out on the fly, and I was learning from all of you. I remember the first time I walked into the studio to record, you were actually, I was coming in at the tail end of your session. And so I walked into the studio, but the control room and the booth you were in were pretty small. And so I could see the television with Lena Inverse from Slayers on the screen. And we had the 3 beeps, and then Lena's mouth started moving, and as always, your voice came out of her mouth. But then in the middle of the line, you messed up the line. And I couldn't see you in the booth. All I could see was the television of Lena. And I remember it freaked me out. I was like, Lena messed up her line? That never happens. All of her lines come out perfectly. Oh, right, there's a person in there. It was like realizing, oh, crap, right, Lisa's actually in there doing this.
Yeah.
And having to figure out this coordination and patting your head and rubbing your tummy and matching lip flap and trying to be believable all at the same time. So it was a huge, I was learning a lot just from listening to all of you and what you had been doing, and basically just trying to keep up with the rest of you to make sure that, and I remember very early on, I had a fight with the Reza, the Red Priest character, and we did the battle scene, and I was still trying to figure out my coordination. I didn't quite get it. We got it done, and we took a lunch break. And I knew a little bit about Pro Tools, and so I could run the rig. And so I asked Dan, the engineer, I said, can I watch that back? Is it all right if I just watch that fight scene back? And he's like, yeah, sure, just don't mess anything up. I was like, okay, cool. So they went off and ate their sandwiches or whatever, and I was playing the fights back, and I just didn't like it. It was just, it wasn't believable. It wasn't physical. And when they came back from lunch, and I don't think I even ate anything, I was like, Dan, could I please just do that fight scene again? He's like, oh, fine, whatever. And I was like, just one more take. And, and then that was the one that I was really satisfied with. But we were figuring it out because at least for me, I just wanted it to be so good. And I wasn't satisfied unless it was as good as it could possibly be.
We talk about this. We share that, and I know what you're talking about. I was very lucky early on. I was a very, despite all my very visceral, very like in the body, and I still am. And that's always the note that I give when I'm directing or when I've had the opportunity to work with other actors. I'm like, put it in your body, make sure it's physical, make sure it feels like what you're doing, put motion in what you're doing, and trying to work on how to, like, if you stretch something out, how do you still keep the energy of what you're saying so it still sounds like it's organic rather than anything else. But one of the first things, it was actually in Lotus, and I was working with Timony was in there, and I had such like an early beginning actor thing where I couldn't scream and get angry and do battle sequences. And he had me in the booth working. He gave me a physical activity to do. He's like, pull out. He's like, every time you do it, he's like, take your pencil, pull out your sword. He's like, just do that and keep doing that. Put it in your body. Physically do the actions of what you were doing. And for me, at the time, that was like a huge thing. I know that sounds weird. Now I could sit down, I'll give you that. And I know, and I have it in my body. I have it in my head. You can manufacture that. But it was like, for me, I had to chain everything to a physical place in my body. That's why when I was talking about the Lena thing, putting it and setting in there, it sort of brought back the physicality of who she was, even in the personality. But that was just how I work. I always feel like everybody works differently. That was how I anchored. I was very anchoring. That was what I did a lot. I did a lot of anchoring. Yeah. Physical anchoring.
That like neurolinguistic programming anchoring? Are you familiar with that term?
I am. I did not become familiar with that until years later.
Oh,
so
okay.
That's what I mean when I tell you, like, there's a lot of stuff that I did. I was like, oh, there's a name for that. Okay. I'm like, I can now make it a technique, not just that thing I do.
Yeah. And for the audience who may not know, neurolinguistic programming, effectively, it's sort of a self-help, sort of cognitive behavioral therapy thing. Mm-hmm. And one of the techniques in it is that if you're in a certain emotional state, if you physically do something, a physical activity like press really hard on your arm or do a certain gesture, that you can link that physical gesture with that emotional state. And then when you need to quickly go back to that emotional state, you just repeat the gesture. And it's sort of like a bookmark to get you back to where you were emotionally. And you had your physical anchors for Lena when it was time to play Lena.
Yeah, I always thought of it like the moment of putting on your costume before you go into a show, how that gets you into something.
Absolutely. So around this time is actually when I was starting to make my exodus from New York and head to Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. And so it was right after Michael Albin had unfortunately passed, and we had worked on Boogie Pop Phantom, and you worked on Boogie Pop, right?
I did.
Yeah.
I did work on Boogie Pop.
And His and Her Circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
And that's exactly when I left, actually. I was writing the scripts for His and Her Circumstances, and you were acting in it. And I moved to Los Angeles. So tell me about your journey since then. You'd been doing CPM, Pokemon. You'd gotten on the Pokemon train by then, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was on the Pokemon train, I think, and I had been doing a lot of things over in 4Kids at that time. I'm trying to think, the dates sort of all
so that was
launched together.
Yeah, all the other stuff at 4Kids was like Winx, or
I worked on a bunch of stuff there. I worked on Winx. I worked on Turtles. I worked on Sonic X. I worked on Kirby. Like pretty much like everything that was Yu-Gi-Oh, obviously. Uh-huh. And so everything that was there, you went back and forth. You wound up touching a lot of different things and creating a lot of different characters. So for a while, I was regular sort of staple there until that company sort of lost the footing of what it had when basically everything crashed. Like New York crashed. People don't think about it, but that's like that crash of that stock market and things that happened, that affected everything, because that was one of the things that changed that company. And so a lot of the work that was there transitioned out. You got a lot of smaller studios that were around that were doing this kind of work. There was some work that was union. There was some work that you would work on. I wound up doing other podcast, commercial, various different things. Audiobooks kind of came in and moved into that window. So a lot of people were doing that kind of work. And but that sort of studio system that I had described, where a lot of people showed up, I think we kind of collapsed, and then you had something like the times where Funimation kind of grew up into a studio system that was like a larger version of what 4Kids initially was. But that was all after the crash. The crash being 2008? You mean the real estate market? Yeah, I think the real estate crash. There was a lot of people think it has to do. There was a lot of things that we had. They did that Fox block. They put a lot of stuff on, and a lot of shows would start there and then sort of jump off to something else. Like that was one of the things that Winx had a lot of time on there. They had their One Piece, their version. There's talks about like why things happened or whatnot. But I think there was a lot of the change that happened also was tied up in investments and tied up in that crash. So I left right after 9/11. And so, between 2001 and 2008-ish, when that crash happened, you were working with 4Kids, and that sort of studio system was still working? At that time we did, we worked on, I think they had, I'm trying to remember, 3, 4, 5. There was like 6 different studios within that one place, and then they had the offset of like the Taj and different things. Wow. They had that. You had the birth of a lot of other studios. You had Taj kind of took project changed hands. Eventually, you had things like DuArt, where I wound up working later, sort of grew up. So you had all these. We had a lot of smaller studios for this particular thing. You had that world kind of outpaced itself with that. But that the 4Kids heyday before the crash was there was a lot of stuff going on. Like you could just do that if you were working regularly, and you would be fine. And a lot, and you were still, you were fine financially. You were still, we were all still doing commercials. We were all still doing, theater off and other things. And that was. But a bulk of what I had done was there. And then I sort of transitioned at some point into probably around that crash time, around like 2008, into both doing VO work and then sort of trying my hand and sitting in like more directing and having more creative control over some of that stuff. So which was actually, it informed how I worked greatly. Oh, interesting. So with the crash, that sort of 4Kids heyday studio system, I guess, sort of diminished. It switched into these smaller studios, and you started directing. Talk to me about that transition. I was in the course of this. I actually, it's funny. New York is a city where you can do a lot of this work. If you're working union, and if you're doing a lot of union work, you'll have a little bit more of what's going on. But a lot of people would still be doing work on Broadway or doing stuff like that. And when you were in your off season, you were still hustling just with various other things. So you would have a day job or another job or a fallback job or something, because in order to keep yourself in classes and doing all this stuff, you wanted to make sure that you were able to, to meet the demands of the city. So I feel like it's a city that basically it keeps you do a lot of work, and you put your head down and you work. I was actually working in the evenings. In the beginning, I would do my voice work all during the day. And then I had, I was a diligent actor. I was told, make sure you get your flexible day job. So my flexible day job was a night job. in a financial institution. I worked at Merrill Lynch, and a lot of actors and performers and dancers and really amazing creative people were working here because it was a way that you could get health insurance. And you could get hours. They would let you work however long you needed. You make your hours. You could go away on tour. You could do a show. You could come back, and you could come in and do that. So that system, I was doing that. That system also crashed when the stock market crash came. But prior to that, Again with motor vehicles, I had a studio director who wanted me to work on the weekends, and I refused because I was like, I don't work on the weekends. The weekends are, I'm only going to work during the day. I'd come a long way from not taking a bathroom break and a sandwich, and so he had. I lived up in the Upper West Side at the time, and there's this beautiful highway, this beautiful Hudson Highway that goes down the road, and that goes down this side off of the Hudson River. And he's like, I used to live in your neighborhood, and he had a motorcycle. He's like, I would ride the bike, down that. If you ever want, if you will work for me on a weekend, I will pick you up on my bike and ride you and, take you down the river ride. So I was like, all right, I'll do this. I have a very I was like, I'll do that. That's the only reason why you'll get me to work on a Saturday. So he did that once. So he's like, okay, you could work on a Saturday. I'm like, great, I'll come in. Did not pick me up on that. I was very upset. I was like, you have tricked me. But what wound up happening is we wound up having a talk about the company at the same time. And he was looking for somebody to come in and assist and produce and direct. And he's like, do you have any recommendations? This was a time I was working with Maddie Blaustein also. If you remember Maddie, she was the original Meowth. She was writing scripts and doing a bunch of adaptations, and she was working at this particular company. And this guy was like, well, I'm looking for somebody to kind of come in, direct, and produce and do a whole bunch of things. And do you know anybody who you think you would recommend? And I was like, well, what are you looking for? And he's like, honestly, someone like you who's been doing this for a while. And I was like, well, how about me? And I say this, but I also want to emphasize that these are all things that there is a lot of serendipity that colors, but I already had a lot of years under the belt. So I was able to kind of take that opportunity. It wasn't like it was I just walked in and was like, hey, but I was like, how about me? And he was like, really? Would you be interested? I'm like, yeah, sure. I'm like, I'm working at this bank. And I'm like, let's do this. I still had a very working class, very still keep, make sure you're covering everything. You're working. I was not, I was very scared of the starving artist idea. So I overworked myself like many New Yorkers do, picked it up. I wound up working in that studio. That is where I cut my teeth directing on a lot of things. And this was a lot of stuff I had done directing projects. I had coached other people before, but it was an opportunity for me to, he met what I wanted. It was an opportunity for me to go in and for the first time sort of take that creative process that I had and put it onto other people. And it was, we did not work on the highest of caliber, always animation, but I brought everything I could to it. And it was a great process. It was my on the ground training on that. And that led to later on. So I started directing that. I was still doing voiceover. I was still doing various other things. And that would eventually lead me to coming back and to the directing side, being with working on Pokemon and doing that on that side. But it would also open up a lot of opportunities for me there is no better way to learn about your acting than working with everybody's different styles.
Yeah. Absolutely. It is fascinating because you think, okay, I'm going to figure out my own acting technique and my own process. And then suddenly you have to coordinate with 20 other people's acting processes, which are radically different from your own. And you're like, okay, time to put a different hat on every time I'm dealing with a different actor. So this was the sort of paradigm shift that happened then after the sort of crash of 2008, 2009-ish. And then was that the sort of new paradigm for you for a while?
For a while, that was where I wound up. I know that a lot of, it just wound up being smaller studios, especially in New York, that were handling that kind of work. Like I said, you still had a lot of like Kids Nickelodeon. You still had a lot of other projects that were going on in other areas. But that was such a large company that when it changed, and then it became Konami. It was a little bit of a different market, but for me, it was an opportunity to grow in a different way, and then add that to my work.
And what was the company you were directing for?
At the beginning, I directed for a company that was called AudioWorks. They brought me in, and then eventually Duart came in and scooped me up out of there.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And so we're now in the 2008, 2009. We're in the post sort of 4Kids world. Is Duart then one of the major players? Who are the major players at that point?
No, at the time the players the same. 4Kids lasted for quite a while. I actually don't have the dates on there. We were working into like the 10s, I think.
Okay.
And then it shifted. The project. Pokemon had moved to Taj. Taj had done a number of things. Then that sort of transitioned out. Duart came in and they picked up a number of projects. They did Pokemon on there. They also did a number of other things. And there was a lot of animation that we worked on that would go to Europe or would go and I'm talking specifically about this. It's sort of like the animated dubbing market. There's a whole bunch of other things. People are still doing theater. People are still doing, animation and podcasts and various other things. But this big beast that had been in the room, it shifted all over. And there was a lot of very talented people doing a lot of animation that was maybe not as high profile as some of the other work that was going on. But a lot of it would go, some of the stuff we had done aired in Europe, or we aired in, I think I had a project that aired on Nickelodeon in India. I had projects that aired here, on Netflix and Nickelodeon and various different things. But there was this sort of it was more of a global market. We just kind of we created a lot of work and got to cut our teeth on stuff that maybe didn't necessarily grow into the mainstream the same way, but was a great but was keeping people working. We were doing consistent. We were putting everything that we had into it.
Gotcha. So then what inspired the move to Los Angeles? Because you are speaking to me from your booth in LA, not in New York.
Actually, I remember when you moved, and I remember everything that was happening at the time was such a strange. It was after 9/11. There's a lot going on. There's still plenty of work of still working with NYAV, still working with a bunch of other studios that were out there. But I had thought about moving about 5 years before I came out here. And I had worked on a project for a couple of large companies. I worked on a Lionsgate project and some things, and I had wanted to move out. I wasn't able to at the time because I had some family business that I still had to take care of in New York. And when this happened, the opportunity came to kind of to be out here. I had my eyes on coming out here for a while. There was more work and more of the kind of work that I wanted to do consistently out here. And that's one of the things I think people who are doing this, there's now that the pandemic for a while, and we don't know how long it will last, there's been sort of a coming down of walls. But for the longest time, you want to be where most of the work is happening. And more of the work was happening out that I wanted to be a part of, that I found interesting, was happening for animation and for voiceover, was happening in LA.
Gotcha. So you moved out to LA in 2019?
I moved out. I moved out 2019. My project went by, the project that I was sitting on went by coastal, so it was good. I will always come in with my my working class mentality. I work a little too much, but yes, I came in. I had a project that moved out here. I was able to come out and move out here and set myself up. I finished packing up. I came out, found a place. The first few in January of 2019. The first 2 months, I kind of went back and forth, taking care of a bunch of business. I still had a lot of family stuff. My mother was ill at the time, so I was taking care of a lot of stuff from her. But then February of 2019, I packed in my New York apartment. My intention was originally to still be bi-coastal, but for some reason, I wasn't able to do that at the time, and I was told to pack up, which I was not prepared for. So I packed up my apartment in February, and I came into LA, and then we went into lockdown. So,
Oh my gosh.
so which is fine and is fine and interesting, but there's been a lot of things that have blown up and have happened here, but it's a different sort of market than it's a different sort of way of doing things. And I imagine you already established and settled here. So picking up with the experience that I had in moving to a new market, you start to get to know people and you start to sort of figure out where you are. So that made it a little bit different.
Yeah, no, I mean, you faced a unique challenge, which was not only were you leaving a marketplace you were familiar with, New York, and moving to a marketplace you were unfamiliar with, Los Angeles, but then Los Angeles became unfamiliar to those of us who are even here.
Yes.
Right? LA became its own strange world during the pandemic lockdown, so that faced all sorts of challenges. But based on your experience so far, what are the main differences, in your opinion, between the sort of New York marketplace and the LA marketplace?
There's definitely, I don't know if we can, talk on this for a second. There's also a transition. There's a lot more. It's similar in the sense that there's a lot of studios systems that are out here. There's a lot of different places sort of casting there. The agent system always remains the same. So I kind of am leaving that out once you get into that. There's just a lot more, there's definitely a lot more video game things that are going out here. There's a lot more, there's just a lot more animation in general. And I remember coming out here, I was talking to one of my friends, one of the people I'd known for a long time, Sam Riegel, and I said, I don't want to come out. For me, I come out with a lot of experience, but that doesn't mean you know a market, and it doesn't mean you know a style, because there's a different way of there's kind of a bit of a different voice and a different approach to things in certain cities, and that was one of the things that I was excited to do, is to come out for the first time in a long time, because I taught dubbing, and I taught various other things at NYU. I did some master classes over there. I had taught workshops in voice in Korea, but I wanted to come out here and be a student again and kind of get that excitement back, which was it's interesting. I think that there's a lot more work. There's a lot more union strong going on. One of the things that happened in the New York marketplace is that some of the work that they had, there was a lot of work that outpaced the contracts that they had in some of the unions and different things. So you had this mix of prominent union and non-union work that was very confusing to a lot of people. So there's a lot more strength. There's a larger community out here of people doing that same kind of work. And it's interesting. I'm still exploring. I'm still finding out what it is out here. But it is very interesting to me to stylistically sort of be listening to how things are done, and learning the different ways that various different places approach. And there's sort of been, I think, a rebirth, much the same way that we had with animation when we first started out. When you and I started out, I feel like there's a big burst of live action dubbing that's happening now, which is a totally different beast. is a lot more nuanced, and I find it very fun.
Yeah. And I think people need to understand, like, there is the Actors Union, SAG-AFTRA, which applies to all the recorded media that actors perform in. And Los Angeles is very much a union town because there's a lot of work that's done under the SAG-AFTRA contracts. It becomes a bit more challenging in other marketplaces. When you're in New York or Dallas or San Francisco, or Chicago, any of these other cities, there is usually not as much union work to be done. And so there's a lot of non-union work that shows up. And so when you're in a marketplace like New York, you have to try to negotiate union and non-union work. And one of the things about being a union is that global rule 1 in the union is you're not supposed to work non-union. And so this makes a sort of challenge for people in these marketplaces because when you start off, if you're not a part of the union, you can work non-union. There's no rules about that. But often the non-union contracts don't pay very well. And sometimes it can feel like they can be possibly a bit exploitive. And so the union is there not only to make sure that there's a sort of wage floor, but also working conditions. There have been times when I've had to push back against people when I was in New York about the conditions I was working under, because it's also about safety and vocal health, making sure you're not blowing your voice out, doing too much stuff. So I can understand it can be a challenge working in those marketplaces where you're sort of in this liminal space between non-union and union work before you can get enough union work to not have to work non-union anymore in order to make ends meet. And New York is also different because it's not just an entertainment town. I mean, that was one of the things that was big for me, was that in New York, people do things other than entertainment.
This is a big shift for me being here. It's a very big shift. Yeah.
But I like this idea that you're trying to learn the sort of, for lack of a better term, style, the LA style. What have you learned so far? What is it that, as a student of LA, what are you learning?
I mean, most of it, and to be clear, like when I go into that, there's a lot of stuff that you know, but I never want to go into a place and be like, I have a lot of experience. I have a lot of I have a lot of history to pull on, but you want to learn how people work. It's this, and I think this is also something, and I'll come back to the union non-union thing in a second, because part of what happens with that is that sometimes the contracts in some areas outpaced each other and created something, and we're working very hard to fix that now, so that the rift between these two things sort of comes together and makes it more union and more standardized across the board. But I've always come back to this, I've always come in with the idea that I could come in and say, this is how I do things. But I think it also has a lot to do with the style of how I approach work anyway, is that I want to know how things are done. Even when I'm working in the booth, if I'm working with an actor, or I'm working as an actor, I'm like, how are they approaching this first? And then you take your technique, you take what you're doing, and you modify it to create what you want to do. So I don't want to impose my ideas on someone, because I feel like that limits creativity. Mm-hmm. So if I come out here and I'm like, this is how I go, and this is how I do things, I'm not listening to what someone wants. And even with theater, that's always been my approach, has been, what does the text want me to do? What is the story that's trying to be told and then what can I bring to that story? Mm-hmm. So as opposed to, that I'm still learning. There's a little bit more of there's some places want a little more naturalistic. Some of them are a little bit, some places have a little more heightened realism. I mean, there are too many, there are too many styles to even talk about it. Like, you go into video game, I always feel like that's a little more cinematic. I always feel like animation is a little more, is a little bit more of a stage, like musical theater energy that you bring to it. So you see, I'm always trying to tie it to a physical space. Yeah. I'm always trying to make the sound stage of where this is all happening happen. But I'm still in the process of learning that. I don't think that you ever get to a point that you can feel like you've you've learned everything and there's nothing else that you can add to it. And so I try to, that's sort of what I'm still exploring the city, which in a pandemic makes it hard.
Yeah, it makes it hard. No, I was just curious because I went through the same adjustment period when I came to LA, because I came to LA and thinking like, oh, I've got this, I know how to do this, it's going to be great. And then there was it was a gear shift. Like, it was entering a different climate and going, oh no, things are done differently here. And a lot of what I had to learn was to put in that more cinematic sensibility. That much of my performances in New York had been more theatrical, had been more presentational, and that didn't fly in Los Angeles. They wanted their serious and gritty, certainly in video games, but even in something like American superhero shows when we were working on Young Justice. This is deadly serious stuff we're doing. And that was very different from the kind of stuff that we'd been doing in Slayers, which was far more slapstick.
That's, we all watch the various different things, and that's why I think that what you're saying is very true. And that I knew there was more of a grounded realism that happened over here. And even in New York, I would have people would ask, like, what's your style? I'm like, it really depends on what it is. Even in a show, even in a particular show that you're working on, you can have so many different styles and different moments in it. That's one of the things that I like. The Slayers is, to me, very very vaudeville, very presentational, very big. You can drop out some of the subtext. You can get a little more in your body and a little broader in what you do. And then you get into that VG work, and that is the difference to me between then bringing I would talk about video game more cinematic realism than opposed to like the broader cartoon stuff that was being on the stage, or being a little more musical theater with how you did things. You could go out a little bit more. You could lose a little of the bottom as long as you had the basic, as long as you had as long as you had you kept a basic reality in that world. It didn't have to be, you could still put a lot of colors in there without making it too complex.
Yeah.
But I'm still learning that. I'm trying to figure out, and I think that this is something changing into a new market, especially when you've been doing things for a while, is like which paint kit are you painting with in each project?
Yeah.
Like, was that hard for you? Was you surprised by that? Or did you feel like, oh, this is just a new puzzle I have to figure out?
Oh, I got my butt handed to me because I got cast in, I've talked about this on the podcast before, but I got cast in two major projects and got fired from both of them because I was not up to speed yet. And one of them was Digimon, the fourth season of Digimon, and then the other one was the Cowboy Bebop movie. And in both cases, in the Bebop movie, I was miscast. It wasn't anyone's fault necessarily, but I was just miscast. I was not quite there. But in Digimon, I just didn't have the skills yet. I wasn't ready for Major League Fastballs. I just wasn't on that level yet. And it took about 6 months of taking acting classes and sort of steeping myself in the culture of LA and the zeitgeist before I could do it. And then 6 months later, I was in the booth with the same director, Mary Elizabeth McGlynn, who directed me on Digimon and the Cowboy Bebop movie. And I was able to do what I couldn't do 6 months before. So it took learning and absorbing and grokking and getting my butt handed to me, not only by being fired, but I'd get an acting class. And I had some wonderful teachers, Morgan and Mark Shepard. And Mark, who was famous for Firefly and Battlestar Galactica and whatnot, and he'd be like, "No, what are you doing? That's not, no, don't even start." He'd just be at me, and I'd be like, "Wow, he's right." And then because I'd come from a New York world, I was used to tough directors. I was used to tough teachers. So when Mark was tough on me, I was like, he's tough on me, but he's right. And if he wasn't right, then I wouldn't be into it. But I'm into it. Teach me how to do this, Mark. How do I make this better? And that really helped. But I still had to translate it because Morgan was a wonderful teacher. He was on Gargoyles, and he was in Max Headroom and a bunch of other stuff, Doctor Who and whatnot. And I remember coming up to Morgan and saying, "Hey, my acting's getting a lot better, but how does this help me play Daffy Duck?" And he's like, "I don't know." So even then with what I was doing, I still had to take what I was learning from the sort of Los Angeles zeitgeist and translate it into, okay, how does this work for Looney Tunes? How does this work for Nickelodeon? How does this work for video games, Call of Duty? Like, how do I translate this to make it believable in all these different environments?
It's that's that I think that's really important, and I think the thing that I came here with my head on my shoulders, which I didn't have when I first started, was that I know enough to know now that I know a lot, and I know a lot, which makes me know that there's a lot that I don't know. And I also know that over the course of a career, especially when you're in a particular market, or you start working with people develop shorthands. You develop shorthands. You didn't even know you're developing shorthands. And that's sort of the time on the other side of the mic lets me do that too, is where I'm like, I can see other people's tricks. And so I know that I have them.
Yeah.
So when I find somebody who can pull me out of that, that's a good thing. But one of the most and I'm looking forward to even more doing that. When I walk into a room, I try to walk in as new as I can. I think I started the first thing as soon as I got off the plane, I got I wound up in Charlie Adler's class. There was an opening, and I literally had just landed in New York. I got off of the plane, and I got off that day, and it had started, and I was like, this is going to be great, because, I grew up watching him, and he called me like New York for the first beginning of it. And he's like, you seem to be having a lot more fun and a lot more freedom. But he was like, what I loved about that, and a lot of the people that I've been studying, that I've worked with and sort of gone in here, I don't walk in and tell them everything that I've done. I just walk in as me, and I don't want to talk about the work that I've done before. I just want to know what they see when they come into the room. And so the stuff that he called out, like stuff that I wearing two hats, wearing director brain, or like you wearing teacher brain, you call these out. You have this, you have that like this goes to here, this goes to here. There's an intelligence that you have when you break down your copy. But the thing that I found on both sides is that sometimes the more you do this and the better you are and the easier it becomes in some ways, you develop these tricks, and then most people can't see your gears move, but when the people do see your gears move and call it out, it's because that's what's going to flip you over into the thing that makes your work really good. And I don't know if that makes total sense, but I think it is. I think it's like you can probably hear more in a read that I do than maybe someone who's just starting out.
Oh, yeah.
But at the same time, someone who's completely not trained can listen to both of those things, and they're not going to know what they're responding to, but they know that there's that extra little something in one of them that isn't there in the other.
Yeah.
And that's when I talk about like trying to go back to like this organic thing. But yeah, that's been an interesting thing for me, because I've gotten really excited being in rooms and being adjusted or working with some, different coaches out here, because I still do. I mean, just because I coached where I was I don't want to bring that. I want to find what's new here. And it is always exciting to me when they call me out on something that I'm like, oh, I know exactly what you're talking about because I've seen that somewhere else. And then you get to kind of like tweak and work on it. And that's been very exciting to me.
Nice. I really appreciate Lisa's relentless focus on improving her acting skills. Even after all of her experience and study, she's still committed to learning more, and she still approaches acting with a sense of humility and curiosity. It's a truly admirable mindset, and I encourage all of my listeners to emulate it. There's a cliché that I've heard many times from established actors, and you may have heard it as well. Often in interviews or sometimes when they're teaching a class, experienced actors will say they're lifelong learners. They claim they're always studying, always striving, always trying to get better. I'll be honest and say that when I was younger and just starting my acting journey, I didn't believe them. I thought they were saying that just to encourage me as a beginner to develop a good work ethic. As an acting neophyte, I knew that my abilities were not on par with the actors that I admired. So I was committed to practicing diligently in order to improve my skills. But I still thought that at some point my skills would mature. I would learn everything I needed to know, and I would arrive at some metaphorical finish line as a complete and comprehensive actor. When teachers of mine would tell me that they never stopped learning and that they were always trying to grow and expand their skills, I would nod dutifully, but I always suspected that they were feeding me platitudes. Surely at some point an actor's skills become good enough and they don't have to work so hard at it anymore. Surely there comes a point when you've mastered the craft of acting and it's just second nature to you. Isn't there some end goal where your skills are sufficient and you don't need to study anything else in order to be an accomplished and successful actor? Well, speaking as a voice actor who has been working professionally since 1997, the short answer is no. The long answer is hell no. The fact of the matter is that acting is a supremely competitive industry. There are always new challenges to face, new markets to explore, and new competition to test yourself against. Actors are like athletes. We must be constantly striving to expand our abilities, or they will eventually atrophy and we will no longer be competitive in the marketplace. Any professional basketball player will tell you that just because they're playing in the NBA doesn't mean that they're not practicing every day to improve and sharpen their skills. There's a phrase I'm fond of. If you're not growing, you're dying. The moment you stand still and stop expanding your skills, the acting world will begin to pass you by and leave you behind. However, this doesn't mean that you should despair that professional acting is a relentless treadmill that demands that you keep toiling endlessly in order to stay relevant. Quite the contrary. The fact that the voice acting industry is always generating new challenges means there's always new mountains to climb, new horizons to cross, and new goals to achieve. It means that voice acting never needs to become boring or routine. There is an excitement that comes from knowing that with each new character, each new story, and each new set of collaborators, there is joy to be found in exploring the possibilities of artistic expression in those novel environments. Take satisfaction in knowing that you will always have fresh new problems to solve and new ideas to explore. Embracing the unknown with enthusiasm not only keeps you young at heart, but it helps you continue to grow as a person. The future is an endless journey full of possibilities, and it's wonderful to realize that rising to meet each new challenge can be exciting and invigorating. In the next and final part of our interview, I ask Lisa what inspired her to become a performer in the first place. It turns out that some of the biggest influences on her desire to pursue acting were the public library system, Shakespeare, and her love of cartoons on TV. It's an eclectic mix that I find fascinating, and I'm eager to share it with you next time. As I mentioned at the end of the previous episode, the 10th anniversary of the Voice Acting Mastery podcast is rapidly approaching. I released my first episode on July 1st, 2011, and it has always been my goal to provide the most concise and useful content when it comes to this topic that we all love. In honor of the podcast's 10th anniversary, I would so appreciate it if any of my listeners would be willing to call in and leave a message about how voice acting mastery has influenced your own acting journey or any other part of your life. I'd like to feature some of these messages and respond to them in the 10th anniversary episode in July. You can leave a voicemail by calling 323-696-2655. Please remember to state your first name and what city in the world you're calling from before leaving your message. I'll include the call-in number in the blog post associated with this episode at voiceactingmastery.com. Thanks again for listening, and as always, I wish you all the best in your voice acting endeavors. Take care.
You've been listening to the Voice Acting Mastery podcast with Crispin Freeman. To get your free report revealing the 5 most common mistakes to avoid in voice acting, point your web browser to www.freevoiceactinggift.com. Thanks for listening.
You're listening to Voice Acting Mastery, episode number 173.
Welcome to the Voice Acting Mastery Podcast with Crispin Freeman. VoiceActingMastery.com is your place to learn both the skills and the mindset you need to become a professional voice actor, even if you're just getting started. In each episode of this podcast, you'll discover valuable tips, tricks, and insider information to help you portray characters in animation, video games, and beyond. And now here's your host, voice actor Crispin Freeman.
Hi there. My name is Crispin Freeman, and I'll be your guide through the world of voice acting. If you'd like to know more about me, feel free to check out my personal website at www.crispinfreeman.com. Welcome to the second and final part of my interview with voice actress and voice director Lisa Ortiz. Lisa has worked on such seminal anime series as Record of Lodoss War, The Slayers, Revolutionary Girl Utena, and The Irresponsible Captain Tyler. She's also played many characters in Pokémon, in addition to voice directing over 150 episodes of the show. Lisa and I started voice acting in anime in the late 1990s. But whereas I moved to Los Angeles in late 2001, Lisa has only recently moved to LA in late 2019, after having spent the previous years pursuing voice acting and voice directing in New York City. I've been eager to get Lisa on the podcast to share her East Coast perspective on voice acting for those of my listeners who may reside closer to the Big Apple than to Southern California. As we dive deeper into our discussion, I ask what inspired Lisa to become a performer in the first place. It turns out we both got into acting for very similar reasons. Lisa's primary motivation for pursuing acting was to understand people better. She was shy when she was young, and found acting to be a useful way to help her understand other people's psychologies and motivations. I, too, was an incredibly shy person who didn't always understand the emotional physics of how people related to each other. Role-playing as different characters in different situations gave me a safe space to explore both my own psyche as well as the psychology of other people so I could relate to them more effectively. Another huge influence on Lisa was the public library system. Her family lived on Long Island in New York when she was young, and they didn't have a large budget for entertainment. Lisa's mother would often take her daughter to the library, where Lisa was able to explore not only literature, but all the audio and video resources in the library as well, including recordings of famous Broadway shows. The public library was an invaluable resource to Lisa. It allowed her to learn about storytelling in ways that never would have been available to her without it. Access to such a wealth of literature, plays, and music whetted Lisa's appetite for more and inspired her to apply her knowledge of story to performing on stage. As our conversation comes to a close, Lisa shares with me her advice for the aspiring voice actor, including how important it is to develop good vocal technique in order to avoid damaging the very fragile instrument that is your voice. She also stresses the importance of finding a physicality for your character. Rooting your performance in your body will always help your acting sound more authentic and less premeditated. Lisa's got some great insight into the actor's process in this episode, and I'm eager to share her wisdom with you.
And now, the feature segment.
So, what inspired you to become a performer in the first place?
I just wanted to understand people. That sounds so stupid, but
doesn't sound stupid at all. Why would that sound stupid?
I did love. I wasn't terribly exposed to theater. I watched a lot of animation when I was growing up, and I used to turn the sound down and sort of redo and do that. But for me, I was always very shy. It may not seem like that. I don't know how I seem to present differently than how we live in ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And it was one of the first things. I was always a big, it was more, I started more through the literature of working on stuff, through reading and through storytelling than I did when I found the stage. It was an interesting thing to me because for me, it was almost like this, it was this place where, you could understand, you had a place to figure out in a fixed time what was going on with people. So you knew, like, you go in, you get one of my favorite things about scripts is like when you get something, if it's whether it's written the best or it's not, it's like, why are you saying it, and why are you saying it right now? And I feel like, that's something that people are always trying to do when they're talking. Like, why are we communicating? Why are we bothering to say something? And I feel like if you open your mouth in a project, if you open your mouth in a game, if you open your mouth in an animation, there should be a reason why you said that and why you had to say it then. Otherwise, you would just be quiet.
Right. So, I had a teacher once say that dialogue is the last resort. If you could accomplish the goals you wanted without speaking, you would do that. You only speak as a last resort. So you were into storytelling and literature before you got interested in acting? Is that what you were saying?
Yeah, I was. It was more. I didn't come to theater initially because the joy of being on stage and interacting with people and interacting with like an audience and then eventually interacting with the story and telling it, that kind of came after I was more into novels to reading. I was a huge for theater. I was a huge like Beckett and Albee. I was a weird kid. I was in second grade reading sonnets, and like I walked around through second grade like with a thing, and it's like I am somehow related to Shakespeare. Like I was a strange child.
Wow.
But it was, so that was always, and then the thing that led me even more to animation, that's why whenever I talk about Lena, and I always talk about vaudeville, it was the early vaudeville stuff, that kind of on stage, that kind of, I found Mae West. I talk about this because I did a bit of cabaret in New York because for me that was a way to have like my writing, my style, singing and all that, and have control of that and have control of the time that I worked also. But there was a lot of in that early animation that we saw, there was a lot of introduction to people that I wouldn't have seen. Mae West, the first time that I knew who Mae West was and that I started my love of vaudeville came from Tom and Jerry. Because they had a character in there that was this mouse, and this was this voluptuous, it was Mae West. No idea who it was. The mouse comes in and goes, why don't you come up and see me sometime? And I fell in love with this character, and then I realized, where they were coming from in other places. But it's a lot of my love came from early stuff, from the Tin Pan Alley stuff, came from writing, came from I was a huge Beckett fan, so there's a lot of that. Then I learned about theater after that, and I learned about talking and doing and various different things. But it was that's strangely enough, that's what informed me.
How in the world
I'm a weird combination of Shakespeare and then the cartoons I watched growing up. Like,
how did you have exposure to sonnets and Mae West and vaudeville when you were young? You said second grade you were running around with sonnets?
I was, actually. There was I told you I was a weird kid, but also we were not. I came from a very I grew up in the Bronx, like as a little child, and then we moved out to Long Island. But a lot of that was also, we didn't have a huge budget of things. So my mom would take us to the library. And the library where I grew up had one of the most amazing collections of videos, of scripts. I learned that's how I found Gwen Verdon. I was like a third, fourth grader, just playing show tunes in my apartment, singing them out loud constantly. But it was all things that I found I learned through the library, that I did not learn through the stage. I learned through stacks and stacks of books and scores, and then eventually movies and various different things. And that's how I learned about all these things, that and animation, because that's what we were watching. And that is how I learned about that world. I wouldn't even see a performance on stage because my parents didn't do that. We didn't have a huge budget to do a lot of things. A lot of the early I saw a show because the school brought a bunch of us to there. That was my first introduction to theater. From there, I found on the island, on Long Island where I was working, there was a theater company for kids, for teens, that was called Take One. And my mom was very practical. Like we were working, we didn't have like a lot of extra budget. She's like, you want to get a job that you're going to make some money and just be able to pay your bills. That's your goal in life. Your goal in life is pay bills. And it's a hard enough goal that you should be able to reach it. There was no grandness. There was no anything else. And I fell in love with this. I fell in love with doing these things. I went to a show, I think when we were in, I think it was junior high, and I thought it was great. I found a theater company. My mom would have nothing to do with it. You had to pay to be a part of it. She was like, if you would like to join this, then you will find the money and you will go and do that. And so I did. I worked at the library where I got everything that I ever did and used to take out like 15 books at a time and shows and tape cassettes of various different things. And I would listen down to them. And like, that's how I initially taught myself to sing. That's why I say it would be years later that I would get technique. But what I did was imitate I just imitated and not imitated, but I tried to emulate what I was hearing. And yeah, maybe it's a little disturbing when you're like in sixth grade singing Damn Yankees as Lola, but hey, yeah, that was what I did. And it would not be until later when I went to this theater group that I went in, I was working with them. We did, it was early in like high school doing like Lash of the Red Hot Lovers, doing various different things. I kept getting cast in these roles and I did very well. And I was learning from them and learning what I learned on stage. It was a lot of love, raw talent, and interest and study just sort of going on there and learning to do that. I remember us being brought out in a circle after one of the shows, and it was George Castrinos and his wife, and they came and they talked to everybody in there. And and a lot of these kids, I didn't know, but a lot of them, their parents had sent them to theater camps. They had been studying for years already, and they were in, junior high or high school, and they were getting this training. I was working with them, but I was like just saving my pennies from being in the library. And she gave a speech where she said, I know a lot of you are going to go on to become professionals at this, and this is going to be what you're going to do with your life, and you're going to, go from here and continue your skills. And I remember sitting in that room and being like, holy shit, what? Wait, you mean you can do this as a job? This is a thing? I think, Crispin, like going back to what I was talking about being in that room and just feeling lucky and not even wanting to get a sandwich or doing anything, I didn't know how much I was working to get myself to where I was. So it felt like it felt like I stumbled into these things, but you mentioned this, I think, in one of the earlier tapes that one of the other earlier sessions that you had done. I didn't know that that's what it's doing. I didn't know I was collecting all this information. I didn't know that these were influences that I was having, and I didn't know that I was stepping into something that was going that day when I think like Rosie O'Donnell wound up working with her. They were very inspirational teachers in their school. That day in that room changed my life.
Wow. And how old are you when this happened?
God, I was probably like 15, 16, maybe.
Okay, so you're 15, 16, so you're high school age. And
I'm high school.
And
I'm high school. And the reason why I went to Hofstra University is because he taught there. Or he had taught there at some point.
Who had?
Did not know. Like I auditioned for other things. Like I had auditioned for like Julie NYU and all these other things. I couldn't afford them because I couldn't get enough scholarship money.
But who taught at Hofstra that you followed?
George Castrinos.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he was the one who told me about Hofstra. So I was like, okay, and I knew they had this great Shakespeare department. The Shakespeare that I found, I like literally I was a weird kid, man. I read the dictionary. There was on the bookshelf in my home, for some bizarre reason, there were two books of Shel Silverstein, and then next to that was the complete works of Shakespeare, and then, next to that was the Bible, and then next to that was the dictionary. So I read them all, and I was like, this Shakespeare guy is pretty cool. I was like, and I still have, I remember doing that was the kid I was. And I remember the first sonnet that I ever memorized. Yeah, which was "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" And then so when I also found out that this is why I tell you it's like weird serendipitous. When I found out Hofstra was a very strong Shakespeare school, I went, and that's what I thought. Not knowing the pathway of a Shakespearean actor would be something different. And that was the same way that I felt in that room when his wife said, like, you guys will grow up to be this, like, you could do this. I was like, holy cow. That was the same day. That was the same thing I felt when I walked into the room for Lotus.
Wow.
I was like, holy cow, you can do this, and this can be something that you do. And the thing is that I don't know. I think sometimes over time when we're talking about losing or gaining, you can gain bad habits, and it's very hard. It's very easy sometimes because sometimes you work on some wonderful projects that you're really excited about, and sometimes you work on some stuff that you hope you're elevating, And
that's a generous
do you
way
like
to put
the
it.
positive way I say that?
Yes, it's very generous.
You hope you're elevating, and that was a lesson that I learned from Phyllis Ravel, who was rest her soul, she was one of my teachers in Hofstra. And I mean, I've worked with a lot of people since then, but one of the things she said, she's like, your job is not to, people would judge the script and they're like, this is horrible or this is not this. They're like, that's not your job. Your job is to take what you see and make it the best that it can and bring everything you have to that and elevate it. And so, like, it drives people crazy because sometimes you can, you get into sometimes even with, we'll do stuff or kids show us things like that. Like I even have that with the show with Poke. Sometimes you go in and you've been doing, how do you keep 568 episodes fresh? You have to, and you can't unless you retouch your machine, unless you go back to the beginning and stop and say, like, and you unplug from all the time that you had before and you start again. And you're like, okay, let's take it back. Because the fact of the matter is like, I may have seen this, or I may know this genre or this trope or this, I may know that. And this may be my 543rd time, but for the 5-year-old that's watching this or the 7-year-old that's watching it, this is their first time.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I owe this. So if you, and it's hard because and that's why you also you develop tricks, you develop things to get easier. And that goes back to saying, coming into the new market, coming into here, I could come in with everything that I have, but I know that let me find out first what else I'm bringing with me. Like what it's not, I know that I'm bringing skill. I know that I'm bringing years of being able to do this. I know that I have that. That's not going to go away. But I also know that I'm also bringing bad habits with me. So why not let somebody who's been doing this just as long tell me what those are, and then I can tweak them out. One of the coolest pieces of advice I got was actually in a conversation with one of the agents that I'm working with right now. And she's like, one of the things that we find is that, especially with people who've been doing this for a while, she's like, what you were talking about, like that 6-month period. I know I'm going to go in and train and do various other things, just because it's also it's great. It's a collaborative thing. But she's like, you will do what you do, then you will listen to it. And she's like, there's a curve of correction. And that's the thing that you find, where you do exactly what you're talking about, where you process the information that you have, and it gets to a point where you're organic with it. Process the different styles. Oh, okay, this is what I'm hearing. This is what's different from what I'm doing. And that is the work that, and I think that's the audition thing. That's the work that people don't give credit to what they're doing. because it's not just go in and do this one more time. It's not this. Every one of those is an opportunity to recorrect and to do that and to come at things a different way. So that's actually a skill set that you're building. It's like reading or writing or continuing to do things or reading through scripts. You don't, it's not a skill that you lose, but if you leave it sitting on the table, you may get rusty or you don't connect your dots as quickly.
Yeah,
and,
it reminds me of being, I mean, you could be a fantastic basketball player, but when you get put on a new team, it doesn't mean you know what plays they like to run.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean you've coordinated with how this team likes to do things. Doesn't matter how well you can shoot and dribble and pass. You still got to work out your coordination with your fellow teammates.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's, and I think that's, sounds so weird to say. I'm a person who, as much as it is about your lines and everything that you're doing, it's also about transitions. It's also about the reaction of one person into another. And that, I think, is one of the someone I remember working on a show and they told me that once, but it's not just like your lines, your scene, and this is, it sounds basic, but it sort of is a philosophy that applies to everything, is that it's about how the team that we have, even if you're doing animation, it's great. If you have everybody in the room, you can play off of each other. That's wonderful. If you're on stage, or if you're in front of the camera, that's ideal. You're doing a whole bunch of things. You have a bunch of people inputting onto you. But if you're doing something in situations where you're doing video game work where you may not have everybody there, or you're doing dubbing, or you're doing something where you're creating that world, you have to still think about like what you're doing, and is it going to work with who's already there? Like, you're not just accomplishing your mood. You also, because that's a trick that I think that's a pitfall that sometimes happens, especially when people are doing a lot of work, that they mood act, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, they'll just sort of put on an attitude or a mood, and that'll sort of bleed into all they're doing, and they're no longer responding to what's happening in front of them.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's yeah, exactly. And I think some of that is also, of doing things quickly or getting through a lot of stuff. And some people are really great, and that will work. Like, it will pass. And that's how you develop bad habits, is that you aren't present, you aren't in there, and then what you do works. And
or it works well enough, but
that's what I mean.
That doesn't give you that like competitive edge, because people think, oh well, I'm a good actor. Yeah, we got a lot of good actors. Mm-hmm. Only one person can play the part.
Right.
You know, it's not like, okay, everyone's going to build a chest of drawers, and as long as everybody's skills, they can all probably build a chest of drawers. No, we're only taking one chest. Like, there's only one person can get it. So your skills and your edge have to be sharper than anybody else's to get that part. And the nuance, I mean, it reminds me of I just had this conversation with Zara on the podcast, Zara Fuzzle, where she was talking about having gone to a class with Charlie Adler, and he had basically told her, just talk to this other girl in this audition. And she was auditioning for She-Ra. And not for the character of She-Ra, for I think it's Amara in She-Ra. And so she was the former She-Ra. And then when she came in, she auditioned for it, she booked it, and when she came in, Mary Elizabeth McGlynn, the director, said, it sounded like you were just talking to her.
Yeah.
And to someone on the outside who hasn't spent years acting, that sounds like bullpucky. That sounds like, well, I can just talk. How hard can this possibly be? And it's like, no, you don't understand what it takes to strip away all the bad habits, to strip away all the shtick, all the things that you do to try to survive, all the mannerisms, and get to something that's honest and pure. I mean, you see this in film actors all the time. They obsess about this, you know, was it real or was it really real? And it can be really hilarious and sort of, frankly, masturbatory after a while. Yeah. But that notion that we're going for like this super finely tuned edge on things. And what you're talking about when you're going into class and Charlie's looking at you, he can see your shortcuts. And he can go, Lisa, I see your shortcut there. You do that shortcut. That'll work Yeah, 75% of the time, but not now. You've got to, we need it without the shortcut. You know, I want you to build, I want you to cook this thing from scratch. You don't get to microwave this time. Mm-hmm. And sometimes we microwave certain parts of our performance because we got to survive. You know, it can be exhausting. So I totally get it. And what you're talking about makes total sense, even though from the outside it may seem like, oh, you know, just speak it. It's like saying, oh, just dance it. You know, it's like, it takes a lot to be a dancer. It takes a lot to get to that point where it seems so effortless.
Yeah. And I think, and I agree with you. And you can do the opposite too, is like you can either, you know, you can shortcut the one way and then you can spend too much time with, like that's what I talk about, like hearing your gears turn. You can hit all those moments, but you have to get it so that like it's like a greased wheel and it's just kind of working. And yeah, it can sound like you're talking a lot about stuff. But the things that I found is that sometimes trying to explain what you're doing, if you go into it, makes it sound more complicated than it is. But when you say something like that, like you're just talk to them, it weirds people out because it sounds too simple. And I think that's also kind of what I was trying to say, talking about like it's taken a lot of technique and a lot of things to get back to. I think when I first started, there was that organic of just talking and just doing things was always there. And then as you start to develop those bad habits or those and I won't say bad, I say bad habits because that's how I was taught to call it. Okay. They told me bad habits. And, but you know, and I'm a creature of habit myself, but yeah, and I think that's but that's also the most fun. I feel like that's the most fun time when you're just sort of up there, just being and doing and doing stuff. Yeah, and that's one. I don't know because you just said it. Like there you go. Just talk.
No, but it's like swinging a baseball bat is not that complicated. Right? And if you overthink swinging a baseball bat, yeah, you're going to become stiff and then you got no chance. But just because it's swinging a baseball bat is a relatively simple physical endeavor doesn't mean you can play in the major leagues yet, right? Yeah. You got to swing that bat a whole bunch of times, and then you swing that bat, and sometimes it gets stiffer and gets worse, and then sometimes it gets better. Zeami in Japanese No theater talks about this. He talks about the flower of youth and the flower of craft. And the idea is the flower of youth is this thing where if you put a child or an animal on stage, they're usually very compelling. Like you never really want to get on stage with children and animals because they will always upstage you, right? They'll always be more interesting than anything you're doing. And Zeami calls that the flower of youth. And when you're young, that can be very dynamic and interesting to watch, especially on stage. He says, but the problem with the flower of youth is that it fades very quickly. And so you grow out of being the cute kid or the adorable animal, and then you have to develop what he calls the flower of craft. And the flower of craft and your technique and your skill is what's going to sustain you. But we don't want to see your skill. We don't want you to parade your skill around because that's not what we're going to applaud. The point is that the skill gets so good that it looks so transparent that it looks like the flower of youth never faded. Like that the spontaneity never went away, that it's always there. And that sort of commitment to that level of excellence is what I find most often when I'm coming up against people in LA who are really good, right? That they're just working on this like God tier level of what they're doing.
Yeah, and that's I feel like that's a goal. It's the same way. That's one of the things that Diane Towser, who was my voice teacher for many years. She sang opera, did a lot of opera. She worked with Pavarotti, did a bunch of different things. One of the reasons why she would always tell me, she's like, that's great. She's like, I'm not going to tell you. I'm going to show you how to do things. I want to put this in your body so that it's not a technique that I'm seeing your gears run. And if you have it as a technique, she's like, then you need to practice it a whole bunch more so that it just comes out of you, because that's when you know it.
Yeah.
When you're not doing it.
Yeah.
And it just is what you do.
You don't have to think about it technically or analytically. It comes out of you through either muscle memory or instinct, but that instinct has been honed. It has been honed by all that practice so that it comes out spontaneous. Yeah, I did not know any of this about you, Lisa. This is...
Because I came into the room and I was just happy to be there. I'm like, I don't need to talk about any of this.
But, fascinating, this idea that you were basically raised at the library, which gave you access to sort of, dare we call it, the sort of canon of human knowledge and entertainment and literature and storytelling. So you had access to all these sort of classical stuff. And then I'm sure you were watching cartoons on TV at home. And so you had your pop culture, because I know you've talked about, as you've said, you would mimic the voices that you would see in the cartoons and whatnot.
Great radio plays, all that.
Yeah. This reminds me of Chuck Jones. I don't know if you know about Chuck Jones, famous Looney Tunes director, but his family used to purchase houses based on their library. Really? Yeah, back in the day when he was young, houses had libraries. And people would often sell their house and leave the books. And so his parents, being the sort of over-intellectuals that they were, would choose which house they would move into based on the quality of the library in that house. And so amazing. Chuck Jones grew up reading at the library, just like you did. And so that's why when you look at Chuck Jones's Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck, they're doing what's opera doc, right? They're doing the Barber of Seville and Wagner and Duck Amuck, which is like the this wonderful deconstruction, metaphysical questioning of one's existence. You only get that level of sophistication in Looney Tunes with Chuck because he came from this library background, and it makes perfect sense now that you had that sort of dual nature. You had the sort of classical training and the appreciation for the classical stuff, and then the appreciation for the pop culture on the other end as well. It's fascinating, and it makes it's all coming together for me now.
Fantastic. I will say just as a last, it's so funny that you say that. One of the things that I do lament, and this shows a little bit about me, is that the public library, and now COVID is different, but was one of the most amazing things. And what was amazing about it was, first of all, it was free. And I don't think people think about that, because there's a lot of people who don't have access to a lot of things. But the public library was like leveling ground. But right now, we do a lot of stuff online, and you look for the things that you want. So you know what you want, and maybe you get a couple of associations of what that is. When you go into something like that, or you go into a bookstore, or you go into that, or this may be a very New York thing about me, and you wander around, you get all this extra stimulus, like you were saying, these books of different things, all this other stuff that you don't know what it is, and you can just be I have no idea what this is, and then you find something that relates to everything else that you do. And that I think is also, I'm a big improv person with a lot of stuff, but I think that's my first kind of the library was my first jazz.
Yeah, serendipity, absolutely. When I was sound designing more often, I had my collection of CDs. And I made sure that all of my CDs had to fit on one wall. I didn't put them in different places because I wanted the entire corpus of what I had access to in the same place so that I could free associates between them. And the idea that you could be wandering through a library and stumble across something, and it turns out that's the absolutely perfect thing that you needed, and you didn't even know that you needed it, that's kismet. That's sort of how it's supposed to work. That's great. So, let me. We've been going for a while, so we can wrap this up. Let me ask you, what would be your advice to the aspiring voice actor?
Aspiring voice actor, I would say, tackle your career in 3 different ways. Focus on your instrument, work on that technicality, know how to use your voice. And singing is always good for that, to learn your palette and the ways that you're going to do things. And then, take classes with a bunch of people, get that experiential side, do just straight acting and work on that. And then I would say work on straight material. Just look at words and try and build thing off the page. Find like everything that you do has something to do with it. But I would say a lot of people just will like, this is a style. This is the way I work. Try and get as many styles under your belt. And if there's something, even if it's something that you don't know how to do, try it. Try a different style, because there is always a gem in anything that you have. So if somebody has been doing something for a long time, there is something you can learn, and you should keep yourself invested in that. But put it in your body, and always stretch. Always stretch before you have a session, because if you don't, your voice will be tight and you will not perform as well as you want to.
When you say straight material, what do you mean by that?
I mean you should read. You should read books, you should read plays, you should read texts, you should read out loud. Read things that I know people, the same way that people are doing commercials, they work on commercial copy. But I just think anything that is you look at, even if you're doing something that's simple. Like I sound so, it's so weird because I've never thought, like, it's explaining how you do things is different, but focus on your body, focus on your technique, focus on your voice, focus on your instrument, and know how that works and know how to take care of it. Because I see a lot of people now who don't know how to support their instrument, and I worry, and they're talented, wonderful actors, they've worked on that side, but I worry that they're going to damage themselves. But the text, I would say, is like, read shows, read work. Don't just, like, if you go into class and you read short copy, take a play all the way through. Take a thing all the way through, even if it's something small that you're doing. The more worlds that you build, and even if it's just a novel that you sort of pull out, the more worlds that you build, the easier they will be to access when you're in there. And then when you go in, just forget everything.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because when you say straight plays, I think that's or straight work. I think that's a revealing thing, that there's sort of stuff that is straight, and then there's stuff that is genre, right? I'm also like, I still come from that bed of straight and comedy, pop out vaudeville, I'll pop out animation, video game, and all that stuff. But I'm still going back to like Italian Renaissance things when I talk about some of that too. Absolutely.
Still come back to there.
And that's what I was going to go to, because you could say, like, someone might say that they want to be a comic book artist, and they might say, as an American, that they want to draw manga-style comic books, right? They want to draw manga. And I cannot tell you how many times teachers will say, okay, but have you learned anatomy?
Yeah.
Have you learned how to draw the human figure? And in order to do that, best place is usually to go back to the Renaissance, because that's when they were figuring out linear perspective and all this sort of stuff. And there's this resistance. No, I can just draw manga. Not so much. You did it instinctively with Mae West. You saw in that Tom and Jerry cartoon this character that was a caricature of Mae West. And you went, aha, I see this is the recent manifestation of this archetype, but it probably has its roots somewhere else. And so you went back and found the original Mae West. And you're like, oh, this is the original Mae West. But what is Mae West's sort of environment that she's in? She's in vaudeville, and she's in these... Oh, okay. And so what you're doing is you're going back and looking at the stuff that is the actual source material. And like that's the thing. Like, people will say, "Oh, I just want to act in anime," and I'm like, "Okay, great. What other kind of acting do you like?" "Oh, I only listen to anime actors." Yeah. Okay, that's really narrow. You need to be watching all sorts of performances, preferably award-winning ones, and trying to break them down and figure out what makes them compelling and what from that can you bring to anime.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I regularly will do that. And I don't know if it drives people crazy, but I'm like, even when I'm directing, I'm like, okay, this is more of a vaudeville. This is a Parks and Rec moment. Like, this is we're taking it from other things. Like, that's where we're coming. And I think and this is the last thing I'll say about this, but the thing about that too, especially with anime, they're like, coming from other anime pieces, there's a style that's there, but then it's the thing that makes that individualistic and brings life to it is everything that's outside of that style.
Yes.
That you put. Oh, it's music. This is the one thing that we heard. It's like music. You can do you can do a million things to it, but it's all with that. You can't write if you don't know the alphabet. You cannot write if you do not know the alphabet. But once you know that and you know the rules of that, then you can write anything under the sun. You can play any music that you want, and you can just improvise. It does not limit you to know those things. It only gives you more to work with.
Yes. Right. People are always like, oh, I want to break the rules. Well, you can't break the rules unless you know what they are to begin with.
You know what they are. Yeah.
I love that metaphor, that idea of you can understand musical notation. You can play any type of music. But if all you've ever heard is, I don't know, country western, and you don't really understand what makes a chord or how notes work, then you're stuck. And frankly, your country western music won't be as compelling as someone who has that stronger chops, right? That's what we call it, having chops, having technique, having knowledge of that, having anatomy, being able to draw a character with anatomy and then deciding to draw it more stylized. The same way that if you look at Picasso's early work, it's got great anatomy, and then he gets all stylized and different with it if he wants to.
Right, but he only created that and did that because he reacted to what he had originally learned.
Yeah.
You know.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Lisa. Really great advice. Thank you for taking so much time on the podcast. Is there anything else you wanted to promote or anything?
No, I mean, we're still doing Seasons of Pokemon Journey. I just had Emma that came out recently, and there's a bunch of other stuff that'll be coming down the pipeline. But more,
Cool. What about your Voices for Fosters thing?
Voices for Fosters is an organization that we created to help foster animals. Especially, there was actually a scene from Pokemon where Litten loses one of its mentors, and Sarah at the time had lost her cat. I was without. She started fostering. I adopted her fosters, which is how I got my babies, Litten and Boudica.
Nice.
Of
course it's
check
Boudica.
it out.
You don't just call her Booty because you're having fun with a hip hop.
No, Crispin,
name her after a
you at least
historical
know me
character.
better than that. I had my cats always have. I was very, very influenced by Dostoevsky going on. So I have very long pets, and then they come down to the short little names. That's I'm a dork.
Oh, it's brilliant. Look at that. Boudica. I love it. Well, thank you so much, Lisa. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
You're welcome. Thanks.
Lisa and I both have a deep appreciation for the classics and for finding the original sources for the stories and characters that we find so compelling. By classics, I mean the art and stories that are regarded as either foundational or deeply influential to the stories that came after them. In the world of acting, Shakespeare is regarded as a classic author because of the broad range of subjects he covered and the depth of his poetry and artistry that he employed in trying to depict those stories. So much of the storytelling after Shakespeare is inspired by his understanding of character, his mastery of plot structure, and the poetry of his language. However, Shakespeare didn't suddenly appear out of a vacuum. He had his influences as well. Ancient Greek tragedy and comedy are considered the earliest classics of stage drama in Western civilization. Greek tragedies like Oedipus or the Bacchae address fundamental questions of humanity that are still applicable today because our basic needs as humans have not changed. Stories like these become a sort of bedrock for our cultural values, putting forth lessons and themes that later storytellers either reinterpret or contest in their storytelling. For example, the ancient Greek story of Oedipus is about a king who lives with a prophecy that he will eventually kill his father and marry his mother. Through a number of unfortunate circumstances, this eventually comes to pass. The story of Oedipus was a huge influence on Sigmund Freud and his ideas on psychology and psychoanalysis. Freud saw the Oedipus story as a metaphor for the developing psyche of young boys, who can often develop more emotional attachment to their mother and more emotional competition with their father. Shakespeare's Hamlet reverses this equation. In Hamlet, the Danish prince, whom the play is named after, is contacted by the ghost of his dead father, the former king, who informs Hamlet that his mother, the Queen Gertrude, conspired with the king's brother, Hamlet's uncle Claudius, to murder Hamlet's father in order to take the throne. In this situation, the emotional loyalties of the protagonist are reversed. Hamlet's affection is for his murdered father, and his antipathy is for his mother. Critics who study storytelling through the ages have often said that most male protagonists are either Oedipus or Hamlet, because the two characters seem to be on the opposite sides of a dichotomy of who should get a son's emotional loyalty, his mother or his father. Obviously, this paradigm for understanding male protagonists is not a universal rule that encompasses all storytelling. But you can see tropes like these play out in the storytelling that comes after it. This is especially true in pop culture storytelling, which often relies on these classical ideas for inspiration. Disney's The Lion King has often been interpreted as a retelling of Hamlet with lions. Mufasa, the king, dies in an accident that is orchestrated by his brother Scar, who usurps the throne. This also results in Simba the prince going into exile. Like Hamlet, Simba must eventually face the ghost of his father, take responsibility for his position as the rightful ruler of his father's kingdom, and face his uncle Scar to correct the injustice he has perpetrated. Simba's mother Sarabi is not complicit in Scar's plans and is not directly analogous to Queen Gertrude in Shakespeare's Hamlet. But if you understand how the story of Hamlet influences Disney's Lion King, it can help give you a deeper understanding of the characters and how to play them effectively. Understanding classical storytelling structure and character development can be invaluable in quickly identifying the patterns that recur in pop culture storytelling. It can also help give more depth and nuance to your portrayal of certain characters if you understand their classical lineage and the previous storytelling tropes upon which they are based. Lisa's fascination with character and story inspired her to do just this type of research. She would see the current manifestation of a character archetype in an animated cartoon, and rather than just glossing over it, her fascination with story would inspire her to research where that character archetype came from and what might have influenced it. That's exactly what she did with the flirtatious female mouse doll in the Tom and Jerry cartoon entitled Mouse Trouble. In it, Tom gets a wind-up mouse doll who would walk back and forth in a flirtatious manner and repeat, "Come up and see me sometime." Tom tries to use this motorized doll to entrap Jerry, but fails miserably in the attempt. Most children watching this probably had no idea that this doll's attitude was a reference to the famous actress Mae West. However, the character intrigued Lisa to the point where she eventually did the research, discovered who Mae West was, how important her contributions were to film acting, and how her character archetype might recur in later storytelling. My advice to you is to follow Lisa's example and become fascinated with the influences behind your favorite storytelling. As you dig under the surface to try and understand how your favorite characters and stories were constructed, it will give you a deeper insight into character motivations, as well as the underlying meaning of your favorite stories. It will start you down a path of study that will link you to some of the great artists of the past. This is why Lisa felt that she was somehow related to Shakespeare. It's not that she is a direct biological descendant of the bard. It's that in studying his work and practicing his language, Lisa was laying claim to the cultural heritage that Shakespeare left us. You can claim that sort of heritage as well. All you have to do is engage with characters and their stories, and be relentless in discovering where they have come from. The more research that you do, the more patterns you will discover. As you begin to recognize those patterns, your mastery of character archetypes and plot structure will grow. This will eventually lead you to have your own unique insights and interpretations of characters that will make your performances feel more rich and authentic. It will also allow you to improve your ability to improvise characters quickly, since you'll have a more diverse lexicon of character archetypes to choose from. There is great joy in discovering and participating in the long chain of storytelling that links our current popular shows to the ancient wisdom and insights of the past. It can bring a gravity and an authority to your performances for which there really is no substitute. It's also just fun. Many thanks again to Lisa for her insight and wisdom. I really appreciate her taking so much time to talk with us, and I hope all of you have enjoyed our time together as much as I have. As I mentioned at the end of the previous episode, the 10th anniversary of the Voice Acting Mastery podcast is rapidly approaching. I released my first episode on July 1st, 2011, and it has always been my goal to provide the most concise and useful content when it comes to this topic that we all love. In honor of the podcast's 10th anniversary, I would so appreciate it if any of my listeners would be willing to call in and leave a message about how voice acting mastery has influenced your own acting journey or any other part of your life. I'd like to feature some of these messages and respond to them in the 10th anniversary episode in July. You can leave a voicemail by calling 323-696-2655. Please remember to state your first name and what city in the world you're calling from before leaving your message. I'll include the call-in number in the blog post associated with this episode at voiceactingmastery.com. Thanks again for listening, and as always, I wish you all the best in your voice acting endeavors. Take care.
You've been listening to the Voice Acting Mastery podcast with Crispin Freeman. To get your free report revealing the 5 most common mistakes to avoid in voice acting, point your web browser to www.freevoiceactinggift.com. Thanks for listening.